The word hit Calvin Ramsey like a fist to the jaw, and he stood there in the blazing Texas heat of 1884 with his hat gripped so hard in his hands that the brim bent clean in half. "She gives the final word on that side of the ranch every single day," he had said to his foreman, Holt Briggs, not 2 hours ago, and now Holt was standing before him with fire in his eyes and a resignation letter crumpled in one white-knuckled fist. "You put a woman above me," Holt said, his voice low and dangerous, the kind of low that preceded a gunshot. "After 11 years, after everything I'd done for this land." Calvin did not flinch. He never flinched. That was the thing people said about Calvin Ramsey, the gruff cattleman of the Broken Spur Ranch, a man carved from mesquite wood and iron will, who had built the most profitable cattle operation in Bixar County from a single $40 bill and a borrowed horse. People said he did not feel things the way other men felt them. Those people did not know what had happened to him over the last 6 months. "That's right," Calvin said, and his voice was as flat and dry as the hardpan earth beneath their boots. "She gives the final word on that side of the ranch every single day. I said it. I mean it." Holt's jaw worked like he was chewing gravel. "Then you've lost your mind. That woman has been here 6 months and she's already turned you inside out. You don't even see it." Calvin looked past his foreman to where the rolling south pasture of the Broken Spur stretched toward the horizon, the grass shimmering gold in the late afternoon heat. He thought about the moment, 6 months ago, when a train had pulled into San Antonio Station, and a woman had stepped off with a single leather trunk, a green wool traveling dress, and eyes the exact color of the October sky. He thought about how he had stood there with his hat in hand the same way he was standing now, and felt something in his chest crack open like a dry creek bed filling after rain. "No," he said quietly. "For the first time in 15 years, I see everything exactly as it is." Holt stared at him for a long moment. Then he threw the resignation letter into the dirt, turned, and walked away toward the bunkhouse, leaving Calvin alone with the burning sky and the memory of how Ella Rourke had changed every single thing he thought he knew about himself. It had started with a letter. Calvin Ramsey had not intended to write a letter to a matrimonial correspondence bureau. He had not intended to do much of anything that autumn of 1883 except brand the yearlings, settle the accounts with the cattle brokers in San Antonio, and survive another winter alone in the big ranch house that echoed at night like an empty church. But his neighbor, Herschel Dane of the Double Creek Spread, had come over for dinner one September evening, taken one long look at Calvin, and said, "You need a wife, Cal, not for comfort, for sanity." Calvin had told Herschel to mind his own business. Then he had spent 3 hours after supper staring at the fire, and then, in a moment of weakness he would never fully admit to, he had sat down at his desk and written a letter to the Frontier Correspondence Bureau in Kansas City. He had kept the letter short. He was not a man who wasted words. He had said he was 34 years old, that he ran a cattle operation of 12,000 acres in Bixar County, Texas, that he required a woman of practical sensibility who was not afraid of hard work, and that he was not seeking poetry or sentiment but a partner who could manage a household and who would be treated with full respect in return. He had almost not sent it. He had held it over the fire twice. Both times something made him pull it back. The Bureau had replied within 3 weeks with 3 candidate profiles. He had read the first 2 and felt nothing. He had read the third and sat very still for a long time. Her name was Ella Rourke. She was 28 years old, originally from County Clare, Ireland, though she had come to America with her parents at the age of 10 and had grown up in Cincinnati, Ohio, where she had worked as a school teacher for 6 years before her school had closed due to county funding cuts. Her profile stated that she was a competent writer, an excellent cook, literate in both English and enough arithmetic to manage household accounts, and possessed of what the Bureau description called a forthright and independent temperament. That last phrase had been added, the Bureau had explained in a small footnote, at Miss Rourke's insistence, because she had wanted any prospective correspondent to know in advance what they were getting. Calvin had read that footnote 3 times. Then he had written back and asked to correspond directly with Miss Ella Rourke. Their letters had gone back and forth across the distance for 6 weeks, and each one from her arrived folded in a neat square that he somehow never wanted to unfold too fast, as if slowing down could make the words last longer. She wrote with directness and wit. She asked him questions nobody had ever asked him, not what he raised or how many head, but what he thought about when he rode out early before the hands were awake, and whether he ever regretted anything, and what the stars looked like from Texas. He had answered all of it with more honesty than he had intended, and had spent the days after each letter was mailed wondering if he had said too much, and the days before each reply arrived wondering if she would say too little. She never said too little. In October, he had asked her, as plainly as he could manage, if she would come to Texas on a trial arrangement, no pressure, no obligation, to see if the situation suited both of them before any formal arrangement was made. He had told her he would pay for the train fare, and that she would have her own room in the house, and full freedom to leave at any time if things did not feel right. She had written back in 4 days, which was the fastest she had ever replied, and she had said yes. The day she arrived, Calvin had driven the buggy into San Antonio himself rather than sending one of the hands, which caused considerable commentary in the bunkhouse that he chose to ignore. He had stood on the platform of the Southern Pacific Station with his boots polished for the first time in 3 years, and when Ella Rourke stepped off the train and looked around with those calm, clear October sky eyes, something in him that had been wound tight for 15 years. Since his first wife, Clara, had died of fever in the winter of 1869, leaving him alone at 19 with a quarter section of hardscrabble land, and a grief so dense he could barely breathe, that something had very quietly begun to loosen. She had spotted him immediately. He did not know how she had known him among the crowd. She had walked straight to him with her chin up and her hand out and said, "Mr. Ramsey, I'm Ella Rourke. I hope the drive is not too long." He had shaken her hand. Her grip was firm and her fingers were calloused, which told him she had not lied about hard work. He had said, "About 2 hours, Miss Rourke. The road's decent." And then he had taken her trunk and put it in the buggy, and they had driven out of the city in companionable silence that was, somehow, not awkward at all. By the time they reached the Broken Spur, the sun was going down and the light was turning the mesquite trees into something that looked almost like painting, and Ella had looked out at the land rolling away in every direction and said quietly, "It's enormous." 12,000 acres, he said. "No," she said. "I mean the sky." He had looked at her sideways and not said anything. But that night after supper, when he had gone out to the porch to smoke his pipe before bed, he had looked up at the sky over the Broken Spur and really seen it for the first time in years. The first weeks were careful. They were both people who moved deliberately, who measured before they cut. Ella settled into the household with an efficiency that earned the grudging respect of Berta Vasquez, the cook who had managed the Broken Spur's kitchen for 12 years and did not, as she made clear to anyone who asked, take well to interference. Ella did not interfere. Instead, she sat at the kitchen table on her second morning and asked Berta to teach her how to make the corn tortillas, and within a week they were working in the kitchen side by side with the ease of women who had reached a natural understanding. She could ride, as she had said. The second week, Calvin had offered her use of a gentle mare named Persimmon, and she had looked at Persimmon and then looked at the line of horses in the paddock and asked, with perfect calm, if she could instead ride the chestnut gelding at the end. The chestnut's name was Copperhead, which should have told her something. Calvin had started to warn her and then stopped himself and watched as she walked up to Copperhead slowly, held her hand flat at his nose for a long 30 seconds, and then mounted him with a quiet competence that made 3 ranch hands who had been watching from the fence post stop, pretending they had not been watching. She took the south pasture that morning at a canter, alone, and did not come back for 2 hours. When she returned, Copperhead was relaxed and there was color in her cheeks, and she looked, Calvin thought, like someone who had just had a private conversation with something vast and true. "He needed a long run," she said, handing Copperhead to the stable hand. "He's been pen-bound too long." Calvin had told her that was probably accurate. He had not told her that he had stood at the fence and watched her go, and then stood there for 10 minutes after she disappeared over the ridge, doing nothing in particular. The south pasture became her territory by a kind of natural drift over the following weeks. The Broken Spurs Range was divided by a dry creek called Salado Branch into what the hands called the north side, where the main herd grazed, where the branding corrals sat, where most of the daily operations ran, and the south side, where the breeding stock was kept, where the winter hay pastures lay, and where a network of wooden fence lines crisscrossed land that Calvin had always considered slightly secondary to the main enterprise. It was important land, well managed, but it had never had a dedicated eye on it. Ella began riding the south pasture daily. She noticed things. She noticed that 2 fence sections near the South Creek were rotted at the base and would not survive a winter stock push. She noticed that one of the breeding bulls was favoring his left front leg, and that the hand assigned to check the breeding stock had not caught it. She noticed that a water trough near the south windmill had a slow crack that was draining by night. She reported each observation to Calvin with the precise, unfussy manner of someone who had simply seen a problem and assumed it should be fixed. He fixed everyone, and each time he did, he found himself stopping afterward to think about the fact that the problem had been there for weeks and only she had seen it. After the 3rd week, without any formal declaration or discussion, it became understood on the Broken Spur that if you had a question about anything on the south side of the ranch, you asked Miss Rourke. The hands discovered that she gave straight answers and did not waste their time. Berta discovered that her supply estimates for the ranch kitchen were more accurate than the ones Calvin had been providing. Even the veterinarian from San Antonio, when he came out in November to check the breeding stock, found himself in a 20-minute conversation with Ella about the merits of different treatments for respiratory ailments in cattle that left him slightly startled and entirely impressed. It was in December that Holt Briggs's resentment, which had been building like a slow-pressure front since Ella's arrival, finally made itself known to Calvin. Holt was 51 years old, tall and lean and weathered, with the watchful eyes of a man who had survived too many things to trust easily. He had come to the Broken Spur in 1873 as a hired hand and had worked his way to foreman by 1877, and in that role he had been the second authority on the ranch, the voice Calvin trusted to translate his decisions into action. He was good at the work. He was loyal after his fashion. But he had a dark vein of pride in him that Calvin had always recognized and always worked around, the way you worked around a rock in a field. You simply knew it was there and steered accordingly. Ella, who was not a woman who steered around rocks, walked straight into it in late November when she told one of the hands, a young man named Tors who worked the south side, to repair the rotted fence sections rather than wait for Holt's weekly work order. Tors had done it, because the order had come from Miss Rourke, and the fence was clearly rotted and it needed doing. Holt had found out and had been coldly furious in the particular way that was worse than loud fury because it settled in and stayed. He had come to Calvin. "She's giving orders to my hands," he said. "On my ranch." "On my ranch," Calvin said quietly, "and she's managing what she sees, same as I'd want any person with good sense to do. She's not a foreman, she's not even your wife yet." Calvin had looked at Holt for a long moment. "She identified 3 problems on the south side in her first month that your system missed for weeks. I'd say she's earned the right to manage what she sees." Holt had left that conversation the way he always left hard conversations, without a word, with his jaw tight, and with a silence behind him that vibrated like a wire under tension. The relationship between Calvin and Ella was changing in ways that Calvin did not entirely understand and was not entirely comfortable with, because he was not a man who adapted easily to change that lived inside him rather than outside him. He could adapt to weather. He could adapt to a bad market price on beef. What he could not adapt to smoothly was the realization, which crept up on him over the weeks of October and November like a slow tide, that he was looking forward to mealtimes in a way he had not looked forward to anything in 15 years. They talked at supper. In the beginning, it had been practical ranch matters, weather, inventory. But it had shifted. She told him about growing up in Cincinnati, about the school where she had taught, about the children she had taught to read, and the particular satisfaction of watching someone understand something for the first time. She asked about Clara gently and without prying, and he found to his genuine astonishment that he could talk about Clara, about who she had been, about the brief, hopeful year they had had together before the fever, about the loss, without the usual sensation of walking onto thin ice. With Ella, it was more like standing on solid ground and looking at the ice from a safe distance, seeing it clearly for what it was. He told her things he had not told anyone. He told her that he had bought the first piece of the Broken Spur's land the year after Clara died, and that the work of building it had been the only thing that had kept him from doing something he would not name but she understood. He told her that the ranch was, in some way he could not fully explain, a monument to grief built large because larger meant the silence inside him had more room and so felt less like it was crushing him. She had listened to all of this without any of the uncomfortable, sympathetic expressions people usually made, and when he finished she had said, "That's one of the bravest things I've ever heard. Most people let the grief make them small. You made it build something." He had had to look away from her after that. He was not a man who cried. He had not cried since Clara. But he had had to look away for a moment and collect himself, and he was fairly certain she had noticed and had the grace to look at her coffee cup until he turned back. By December, the trial arrangement, no pressure, no obligation, had become something neither of them was naming but both of them were living. He had not asked her formally to stay. She had not brought up leaving. But there was something between them that had the particular gravity of a thing that was real, and both of them were moving around it with the careful attention of people who were afraid of breaking something precious. It was Holt who forced the first open declaration. In early December, Holt came to Calvin in front of two hands with a complaint about a decision Ella had made on the south side. She had told Tors and another hand to postpone a fence repair. Holt had ordered in favor of moving the breeding stock to a different pasture because a cold front was coming in off the plains, and she had been right. The cold front had arrived hard, and the moved stock had been in better shelter. But Holt had not framed it as a question of outcomes. He had framed it as a question of authority. "Your guest," he said, with a particular emphasis on the word guest that was meant to sting, "is countermanding my orders to the men. I need to know whose word stands on this ranch." Calvin had looked at the two hands, who were watching with the careful blankness of men who knew they were witnessing something significant. He had looked at Holt, and then he had said, in the flat, final tone that everyone on the Broken Spur knew meant the matter was settled, "She gives the final word on that side of the ranch every single day. That's my word." The silence afterward had the quality of a bell that had just been struck. Everyone heard it and felt it keep vibrating. Holt had stared at him. The two hands had looked at their boots. And then Holt had walked away, and that had been the beginning of the confrontation that Calvin was now standing in the ash of, with Holt's crumpled resignation letter in the dirt between them and the afternoon burning down toward evening. Calvin picked up the letter. He smoothed it out without reading it again. He held it for a moment, and then he made a decision that was not, in truth, a difficult one, because it was the decision that matched what was already true. He put the letter in his coat pocket and walked toward the south pasture. He found Ella at the water trough by the south windmill, which she had arranged to have properly repaired 2 weeks ago, and which she checked every few days out of what she called thoroughness, and what he was beginning to recognize as love, not for him, not yet openly, but for the land and the animals and the particular satisfaction of things working as they should. She was standing with her arms crossed and her hat pushed back on her head, looking at the windmill with the focused expression she got when she was working something out. She heard him coming. She always heard him, which he found quietly remarkable, and turned around. She looked at his face and her expression changed in the small, immediate way that meant she was reading him accurately. "What happened?" she said. "Holt resigned." She was still for a moment. "Because of me. Because of a decision I made. The decision is mine." She looked at him steadily. The late light caught her hair, which had come half undone from its pins over the course of the day, and the wind moved it slightly. "Calvin, I don't want to be the cause of something that damages this ranch. Holt knows this operation. I know I've created friction. You've created order," he said. "And you've made this side of the ranch profitable in a way it wasn't before." And more than that, he stopped. He was not a man who said more than that easily. He stood there for a moment with the words backed up behind his teeth and the setting sun making everything around them look like a memory of something that had not quite happened yet. "More than that," she said quietly, as if she was giving him the doorway and trusting him to walk through it. "More than that," he said. "I don't want you to leave. Not because of Holt, not because of anything. He stopped again. He put his hat back on his head and took it off again, which was as close as Calvin Ramsey got to visible nervousness. "I wrote to that bureau because Herschel Dane called me lonely, which I resented. But I have been lonely, Ella, 15 years of it. And since you came, I have not been lonely a single morning, even when we don't speak. The fact of you being here is—" He made a gesture with his hat that meant everything he did not have the exact words for. Ella was very still. In the fading light, her eyes were luminous, and her expression was something he could not fully name, but that made his chest ache with a feeling that was the furthest thing from grief. "Are you asking me to stay?" she said. "I'm asking you to marry me," he said. "Properly. Not as a trial arrangement or a matter of practical sense, though you are the most practically sensible woman I have ever met in my life, and I mean that as the highest possible compliment. I'm asking you because the morning you drove in from San Antonio with the dust on your green dress, and you got off the buggy and looked at the land instead of the house, I thought, this is someone who sees things the way they are. And I have spent my whole adult life wanting someone like that and being too stubborn to look for them." The windmill turned slowly in the evening wind. Somewhere to the north, one of the cattle gave a low sound that carried across the quiet pasture. Ella looked at Calvin for a long time with those calm, clear eyes, and he stood and let her look, because he had learned by now that she needed to see things fully before she spoke. "Yes," she said, "I'll marry you, not because I need a home, though this is a fine one, but because you are the most difficult, honest, unsentimental, genuinely good man I have ever met, and I have thought about you every single day since your first letter, which was the least romantic piece of correspondence in the history of written communication, and somehow told me exactly everything I needed to know." He laughed. It came out sudden and unguarded, a sound that startled both of them because it was not a sound that Calvin Ramsey made often or easily. Ella looked surprised for a moment, and then she laughed too, and it was a warm and real sound. And somewhere in the middle of that laughter, something between them finally relaxed into what it actually was. He stepped toward her and she stepped toward him, and he took both her hands, the calloused, capable, honest hands, and held them. And they stood there by the south windmill in the last of the December light. And it was not poetry, which was exactly right for both of them. They married in January of 1884 at the small stone church in the town of Kerrville, Texas, 20 miles from the Broken Spur, in a ceremony attended by Berta Vasquez and her husband, two of the older hands who had been on the Broken Spur long enough to feel invested in its workings, Calvin's neighbor Herschel Dane, who looked insufferably pleased with himself throughout the whole proceedings, and a young woman named Addie Crane. who was a school teacher in Careville and had become Ella's first friend in the county. Ella wore a dress of deep blue wool, not white, which she had made herself over 4 weeks of evenings, and she carried a small bunch of dried wildflowers from the south pasture that she had pressed and saved from the fall. Calvin wore his best suit, which he had purchased in 1877 for a cattle auction, and which still fit him because he was a man of consistent habits. He also wore a new hat, which Ella had arranged to be sent from San Antonio without telling him, and which he discovered the morning of the wedding hanging on the hall tree with a note that said only, "For when you take it off." He had stood in the hallway for a full minute looking at the hat and the note. The ceremony was simple and short, which suited them both. The Reverend was a pragmatic man who understood without being told that this couple did not want elaborate flourishes. When he got to the part where they exchanged vows, Calvin had prepared nothing formal and he said so, and then he looked at Ella and said, in front of everyone, "I promise to see you as you are, and to let you see me the same way, which is a harder thing than it sounds, but I intend to do it." Ella said, "I promise to tell you the truth even when you don't want to hear it, which, knowing you, will be frequently." There was a ripple of laughter from Herschel Dane's direction. "To love this land the way you love it, and to build something here that lasts." The Reverend pronounced them married. Calvin kissed Ella in the straightforward, unhesitating way that he did everything, no dramatics, no performance, just full and present and real, and she kissed him back the same way, and that was that. The first months of their marriage were full and busy and genuinely happy in the particular way that happiness is when it has been earned by two people who went into it with clear eyes. Ella officially took on the management of the south side of the Broken Spur, which was now formalized, written into Calvin's ledger under operations, not as a guest's interest but as a ranch manager's responsibility. She handled the breeding stock records, the south pasture rotation schedule, the water infrastructure maintenance, and the quarterly accounts for that section of the operation. She was very good at it. More than good, she had a gift for systems, for seeing the connections between things that other people saw as separate. Within 2 months of taking on the records formally, she had identified a pattern in the breeding outcomes that the previous informal tracking had missed, and she brought it to Calvin one evening with the ledger spread on the dining table and her finger tracing the columns. "The bull we bought from Dane in 1882, she said. "His offspring have a higher average weight at weaning, but they also have a higher rate of respiratory issues in the first winter. Look," she showed him the numbers. "If we cross his daughters with the Hereford bull rather than back to him, the pattern suggests we get better winter hardiness with comparable weight. I'd want to track it through one more season to be certain, but the direction is clear." Calvin had leaned over the ledger and looked at the numbers for a long time. Then he had said, "Where did you learn to do this?" "Arithmetic," she said, "and paying attention." He had looked at her, this woman he had married for the entirely unsentimental reason of wanting a partner, and who had somehow become the person he looked for every time he walked into a room, and said, "You are the most remarkable thing that has ever happened to this ranch." "The ranch," she said, amused. "And to me," he said, with the particular gruff directness that meant he had lowered every wall he had. "Especially to me." The question of Holt Briggs did not stay resolved for long. Holt had not in the end left the Broken Spur. Calvin had gone to the bunkhouse the morning after the confrontation, found Holt at his bunk with a face carved from stone, and said, "I'm not accepting your resignation. You are good at your work and I need you for the north side. But I am telling you as clearly as I can say it that Ella is a permanent authority here. That is not going to change. Whether you can work within that arrangement is your decision." Holt had said nothing for a long moment. Then he had said, "She's good at what she does, I'll say that." "That's a start," Calvin said. "The rest is up to you." The uneasy truce that followed was just that, uneasy. Holt did his work on the north side with his usual competence and did not directly challenge Ella's authority again. But there was a coldness there, a watchfulness that Calvin noticed and that Ella noticed and that neither of them pretended did not exist. Ella handled it the way she handled most difficult things, by being consistently steady, consistently fair, and consistently clear, until the friction had nothing to grip. By March, something had shifted. The breeding bull with the favoring leg, which Ella had identified in her first month, and which had turned out to have a treatable abscess that, left unnoticed, would have cost the ranch a significant amount, had recovered fully. Holt, who knew the value of good breeding stock as well as anyone, had watched that recovery happen and had the honesty to acknowledge that Ella had caught it and that catching it had mattered. He did not make a speech about it. He was not that kind of man. But one afternoon in March, he had been out on the south side checking a fence line that ran along the boundary of Ella's territory and his, and Ella had ridden up and they had talked, without witnesses, for about 20 minutes. Calvin did not know what was said, but Holt came back from that conversation marginally less like a closed fist, and from that point forward the dynamic on the ranch began to breathe a little easier. Spring brought its own demands. The cattle drives that had defined the Texas ranching economy were beginning to change by 1884. The railheads were pushing further into Texas, which meant shorter drives and different logistics, and Calvin had been watching the changes in the market with the careful attention of a man who had built what he had by seeing where things were going rather than where they had been. He discussed all of this with Ella over supper, over breakfast, on the porch in the evenings, and he discovered that she had opinions about it that were grounded in actual analysis. The market price differential between the San Antonio railhead and the Fort Worth option is not as wide as people assume, she said one April evening, with the ranch account spread across the parlor table. I've been going through the last 4 years of your shipping records. If you factor in the additional trail time and the weight loss over a longer drive, Fort Worth is actually less profitable for your breeding stock. Your South herd is better served staying local. He had sat back in his chair and looked at her. I've been arguing about that with the other ranchers for 2 seasons. You've been right, she said simply. The numbers say so. Show me, he said. Not because he doubted her, because watching her work through the numbers was something he had discovered he enjoyed in a way that had nothing practical about it at all. She showed him. They sat at the parlor table for 2 hours going through the shipping records and the price histories, and by the end of it, Calvin had everything he needed to settle the argument at the next County Ranchers Association meeting, and Ella had ink on her fingers and color in her face from the pleasure of a problem solved, and the lamp was burning low, and the house was quiet around them in the way it was quiet now, in the good way, like a house that was full rather than empty. He reached across the table and covered her ink-stained hand with his. It was a simple gesture. She looked up from the ledger and looked at him, and the expression on her face was the one that still, after 4 months of marriage, made something in his chest feel like the moment just before rain when the air opens up and everything smells of the whole wide world. You know, she said, I'm very glad you wrote that terrible letter. It was not terrible, he said. It was extremely terrible, she said. It read like a cattle specification. I was nervous, he said, which was a word that Calvin Ramsey said about himself with tremendous difficulty, and Ella knew it, and her expression went warm and real in the way that meant she received it. I know, she said. She turned her hand over under his and held it. Me too. The summer of 1884 brought heat and trouble in roughly equal measure, as Texas summers tended to. The heat was the natural kind, relentless, shimmering, the kind that made the horizon quiver and the cattle stand in whatever shade they could find from noon to 3. The trouble was more specific. A man named Silas Vane had been buying up land to the south and east of the Broken Spur for 2 years, assembling a large enough spread to become a significant player in the county's cattle market. This in itself was not unusual. Land changed hands, operations expanded. That was the nature of the frontier economy. What was unusual was that Vane had a particular method of acquisition that had been talked about in low voices at the County Ranchers Association meetings for some time, and that method involved pressuring smaller landowners, through a combination of manipulated water rights disputes and strategic fence cutting that was difficult to prove but impossible to ignore. Calvin had been watching Vane's movements with the cold attention he gave to anything that threatened what he had built. He did not discuss it much, because that was his nature, to observe and prepare before speaking. But Ella had noticed his attention and had begun, on her own initiative, to pay attention too. The first concrete problem arrived in June, when 3 sections of fence on the south boundary of the Broken Spur, the boundary that ran along the edge of land Vane had recently purchased, were found cut in the early morning by Tors, who rode that line daily. The cutting was clean and deliberate, not the work of livestock or weather. 3 of Ella's breeding cows had gotten through before dawn and mixed with Vane's range cattle on the other side. Calvin's first impulse was cold fury and a direct confrontation. Ella's first impulse was more measured. "Wait," she said, when he was pulling on his coat with the particular energy of a man about to do something irreversible. "Riding over there hot-handed gives him exactly what he wants. He's looking for a provocation he can use." Calvin stopped. He stood in the hallway with his coat half on and his jaw tight. "He cut my fence." "Almost certainly, but we don't have proof yet, and proof matters. In a county court, a feeling isn't evidence." She looked at him steadily. "Let Tors get the cattle back. Let me go with him. And let me talk to Mrs. Hawkins." Dorothea Hawkins was the widow of a rancher whose smaller spread had bordered Vane's expansion territory, and who had been quietly displaced 2 years ago in a water rights dispute that the county court had ruled on in Vane's favor despite what many people believed was a manufactured claim. Ella had met Dorothea at church in Kerrville and had maintained a steady correspondence with her, the kind of correspondence between women that men tended to underestimate, and that was in this case a very good channel of accurate information. "What will Dorothea tell you?" Calvin said. "That depends on what she knows. But she has information she hasn't been able to use, and I think she's been waiting for someone to ask the right question." Calvin looked at his half-on coat and then at his wife, who was standing in the hallway with perfect composure and the focused expression of someone who had already thought 3 moves ahead. He took his coat off. "Go," he said. Ella spent 2 days in Kerrville, staying with Addie Crane, and meeting with Dorothea Hawkins over meals and long conversations that she described to Calvin afterward as the most useful conversations she had ever had about land, law, and the particular methods that certain men used to take what they had not earned. Dorothea had kept records. She was a precise woman who had not, despite everything, given up on the idea that documentation mattered. She had records of the dates when her fence lines had been cut before her dispute with Vane, records of the sequence of events in the water rights case, and most importantly, the name of a ranch hand who had worked for Vane in 1882 and who had told her, when he was no longer in Vane's employ, exactly how the fence cutting had been organized. The ranch hand's name was Peabody, and he was now working a small freight operation in Fredericksburg, 20 miles to the north. Ella sent a letter to Fredericksburg with the Kerrville mail carrier and received a reply within the week. She did not tell Calvin what the reply said until she had also written to a lawyer in San Antonio named Trevino, who had a reputation for taking cases that other lawyers found too complicated, and had received his confirmation that he was interested in reviewing the documentation. By the time she laid all of this in front of Calvin, she had been working on it for 3 weeks, during which she had continued managing the south side of the ranch with her usual precision, and had given him no indication that anything beyond normal ranch business was occupying her attention. He looked at the letters, the notes from her conversations with Dorothea, the reply from Peabody, and the letter from Trevino, and then he looked at his wife. "You built a case," he said. "The beginning of one," she said. "Peabody would need to make a formal statement, and Trevino says that the water rights ruling can be challenged if new evidence comes forward. It's not certain, But Vane is not operating in a vacuum, and if we can demonstrate a pattern, Ella. His voice was quiet and had something in it that was not quite the word for what he meant. Why did you not tell me you were doing this? She met his eyes. Because you would have gone to Fredericksburg yourself, and Peabody would have talked to a large, angry cattleman about his former employer and told him nothing. He talked to me because I was a woman asking careful questions over coffee, and men like Peabody have a habit of underestimating careful women. Calvin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Is that the only reason you didn't tell me?" She paused. Honesty was her nature, and it cost her nothing to use it. No. I also wanted to know I could do it, on my own, that I brought something real here, not just as your wife but as myself. He stood up from the table and crossed the parlor and took her face in both his hands, which was not something he did in broad daylight without cause, and he said, "You brought everything. You have brought everything from the first morning, and I need you to hear that." She put her hands over his, and for a moment they simply stood there in the summer light with the open window, bringing in the smell of grass and dust and heat. And it was one of those moments that both of them would remember for the rest of their lives as the exact shape of what they had built. The legal process moved at the speed that legal processes moved in Texas in 1884, which was not fast, but it moved. Trevino came out to the Broken Spur in July to review Ella's documentation and to meet Peabody, who had agreed to come to the ranch rather than to town, which was a distinction that Ella had arranged with a careful understanding of what made men like Peabody feel safer. Holt, who had by this point reached a working respect for Ella that he would not have called warm but was unquestionably genuine, volunteered to ride out and bring Peabody in himself, which was his way of contributing to something he recognized mattered. Vane became aware that something was happening. He was not a subtle man in the way Ella was subtle. He was the kind of man who used blunt pressure because he had found it worked. He rode up to the Broken Spur in August with 2 of his men and asked to speak with Calvin, and Calvin met him on the front porch with the flat, unimpressed expression he kept for people he had already assessed completely. Vane said that he had heard Calvin was making inquiries about his land dealings, and that he hoped there was no misunderstanding between neighbors. Calvin said that there was no misunderstanding at all. Vane said that a man as prominent as Calvin surely had no need to get involved in complicated legal proceedings that could damage both their reputations in the county. Calvin said that his reputation had been built over 15 years and would survive whatever happened next, and that he had nothing further to say at this time. Ella watched the whole exchange from the parlor window, which was slightly ajar, and afterward she said to Calvin, "He's worried. Men who are confident don't come personally." Calvin smiled at that, the small, genuine smile that she had learned was rarer and more valuable than other people's effusive ones. "No," he said, "they don't." The formal challenge to the water rights ruling was filed by Trevino in September 1884. Peabody gave his statement. The county judge, who was a different judge than the one who had presided over Dorothea Hawkins's original case, reviewed the documentation and found sufficient grounds to open a new proceeding. It was not a quick resolution. These things never were, but the pattern of Vane's acquisitions was under scrutiny now, and the quiet network of smaller ranchers and displaced homesteaders who had been afraid to speak individually found, through channels that Ella and Dorothea Hawkins maintained with the methodical patience of women who understood that power worked through persistence, that they were not speaking alone. Silas Vane settled the water rights case in the spring of 1885, without a full trial, on terms that required him to restore the disputed water access to Dorothea Hawkins's former property, which she had since sold but which the new owners, a family named Castro who ran sheep on it, received the water access that was rightfully theirs. The fence cutting on the Broken Spur's south boundary was never prosecuted as a crime because the direct proof remained too thin, but the public awareness of Vane's methods, now thoroughly discussed at County Ranchers Association meetings, made further fence cutting impractical. Vane's expansion in the county slowed and then stopped. Ella never made a public statement about any of it. She did not seek recognition, which Calvin observed and thought was perhaps the most telling thing about her character he had yet seen. She had done it because it was right, and because it protected what was theirs, and because it gave something back to Dorothea Hawkins, who had been wronged and who deserved to see justice even in its imperfect, partial form. That was sufficient. By the time the legal dust had settled, Ella had another piece of news that absorbed her attention more completely than any land dispute. She was expecting a child. She told Calvin on a November evening in 1884, sitting at the dining table after supper, with the particular combination of courage and composure that characterized everything she did. Calvin sat very still. Then he stood up and walked around the table, and setting aside every gruff instinct and every wall and every hard-earned protection, he put his arms around his wife and held her the way you hold something you were afraid, for a long time, you would never have. She felt him shaking very slightly and understood what it meant. "We're going to be fine," she said quietly. "I know," he said. His voice was rough. "It's just I had given up on this, on any of this." "I know you had," she said. "And here it is anyway." He held on. Outside the dining room window, the Texas night was deep and cold and full of stars, and the Broken Spur was quiet in the way it was quiet now, the good way, the way of a house that had something precious inside it. The baby came in July of 1885, in the heat of the summer, which was not the most comfortable timing but was, as Ella said with dry humor in her 8th month, entirely consistent with her experience of Texas so far. It was a boy. He was born healthy and loud, which the midwife from Careville said was the best possible combination. Calvin sat outside the bedroom door for 4 hours during the labor and the delivery, not moving, not eating the food Berta brought and set next to him, unable to do anything but exist in the suspended terror and hope of the wait. When the midwife opened the door and said, "A boy, Mr. Ramsey, and your wife is well," Calvin had to put his head in his hands for a moment before he could stand up and walk through the door. Ella was in the bed with the flushed, exhausted clarity of someone who has come through something enormous and is on the other side of it. The baby was wrapped in the blue flannel she had prepared months ago, his face pink and crumpled and absolutely outraged by the world he had arrived in, and his eyes, when they blinked open, were the dark blue of the newborn that would sort itself out later, and he was the most astonishing thing Calvin Ramsey had ever seen in his life. "Come here," Ella said. Calvin sat on the edge of the bed and she put the baby in his arms, and Calvin held his son with the careful, terrified precision of a man holding something more fragile and more important than anything he had ever managed. The baby squinted at him with the unfocused newborn gaze. Calvin looked back and felt the interior architecture of his life rearrange itself into something that made sense in a way it had not fully made sense before, even with Ella, even with the happiness, because this was the additional thing the piece of the future made physical. "What do you want to name him?" Ella asked. Calvin thought for a moment. "James," he said, "for my father if that's all right." "James Ramsey," she said, trying it. "It's solid." "He should have a middle name," Calvin said. "Patrick," Ella said immediately. "For mine." She had lost her father 5 years ago in Cincinnati, and this was not a negotiation so much as a hope. "James Patrick Ramsey," Calvin said. He looked at the baby. "It's a lot of name for something this small." "He'll grow into it," Ella said. She was right, of course. She was right about most things, and Calvin had long since stopped resenting that and started being grateful for it. James Patrick Ramsey grew into it. He was a good-natured baby, and then a curious toddler. And from the earliest age he showed a particular fascination with the horses that made Ella say he was Calvin's son entirely, and Calvin say he was Ella's son when it came to stubbornness. And this was a disagreement they never resolved because both of them were right. Holt Briggs became, over the following 2 years, something that none of them had quite predicted, a kind of fixture in the child's life. It happened without announcement. James, at 18 months, developed a fascination with Holt's horse, a big gray named Sentinel, and began toddling toward the paddock fence with the determination of a very small person who had a very clear purpose. Holt, who had no family of his own and whose gruffness was, Calvin had always suspected, not entirely unlike his own, started lifting James up to see Sentinel, and then to sit on Sentinel with a firm hand under him, and it became a daily occurrence, and nobody commented on it because commenting on it would have made it something other than what it was, which was simply a thing that was right. The Broken Spur grew through 1885 and 1886. Ella's breeding program changes produced measurable results. The South herd's average weaning weight increased, the winter illness rate dropped, and 2 seasons of careful record-keeping gave Calvin data to bring to the County Ranchers Association that changed the general breeding practices of 3 other major operations in the county. He gave full credit to Ella at the association meetings, which caused raised eyebrows among some of the older members and unabashed respect from some of the younger ones. Ella ran the South Side, every day, final word and all. She rode Copperhead until the horse was too old for the pace, and then she found a young mare at a stock auction in San Antonio, a compact, quick-footed bay she named Bramble, and trained her up to the same standard. She taught Tors and the other South Side hands how to read the breeding records and how to think about the data as a system rather than a set of individual entries. She wrote a 30-page management document for the South Side operations that she kept updated, and that, when Trevino the lawyer saw it during a subsequent visit to the ranch, said it was more thorough than most legal contracts he reviewed. She also, quietly and without making a project of it, started a small lending library in Careville. The town had no public library, and she had been collecting books since childhood and had brought 2 crates of them from Cincinnati. She donated the core collection, arranged with the Careville dry goods store to use a corner of their back room, and spread the word through church and through the ladies who came to the monthly sewing circle that there was a place to borrow books. By the end of the first year, the collection had quadrupled through donations from other households. By the end of the second year, there was a committee managing it. Calvin found out about the library 3 months after she had started it from Addie Crane, who mentioned it assuming he knew. He did not react in the moment. He waited until he and Ella were alone that evening and then said, "Addie tells me you've built a library in Careville." Ella looked at him with the careful expression of someone who had decided not to apologize for something but was still reading the room. "I have. I should have mentioned it." "Why didn't you?" she considered. "Because it's mine. The ranch is ours. The South Side is ours, though I manage it. The library is something I built separately, something that's just me." Calvin looked at her for a long, quiet moment. "That's all right," he said. "More than all right." A pause. "I'm proud of you." She looked at him. The directness of it landed on her the way his direct things always did, full weight, no padding. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means something." "Good," he said. "It's meant to." The second child came in the spring of 1887. This time it was a girl, born in March with the first wildflowers of the season coming up along the south pasture fence lines. Healthy and opinionated from the first hour, with her mother's eyes and her father's jaw. They named her Clara for the woman Calvin had lost, which was Ella's suggestion, offered with the steady, open-handed generosity that characterized her approach to the parts of Calvin's past that needed honoring rather than burying. Nell for Ella's mother, who had crossed the Atlantic with 2 children and a trunk and made a life in a new country, and deserved to be remembered. Calvin held Clara Nell on the day she was born with the same astonishment he had felt holding James, and the astonishment was not diminished by being the second time. He thought it was likely to be the same every time, this particular quality of wonder, and that it was not something you grew accustomed to so much as something you learned to live inside without being entirely consumed by it. Holt Briggs announced, in the fall of 1887, that he intended to retire. He was 54, and his hip had been giving him trouble for 2 years, and he had saved enough over his years at the Broken Spur to buy a small house in Careville and keep a garden and attend to the slower pace of a man who had worked hard for 30 years and had earned the right to stop. He told Calvin this at the end of a workday in October in the barn in the quiet way he told things, and Calvin shook his hand and said he had earned it and that the Broken Spur would not be what it was without him. "It's not what it was before either," Holt said, with the dry tone that was his version of generosity. He glanced in the direction of the south pasture, which was entirely unnecessary because everyone on the ranch knew what the gesture meant. "She made it better. I'll say it plain." "I know," Calvin said. "She'll be glad to hear it." "Don't tell her I said it," Holt said immediately. Calvin did tell her. He told her that evening, and she laughed that warm, real laugh and said, "That is the most Holt Briggs thing I have ever heard." And then she said, "He is a good man. Under all of it, he is a genuinely good man." They drove Holt to his new house in Careville the day he moved. The whole family, Calvin and Ella and 2-year-old James, who mostly wanted to play with the horses, reins the whole drive. An 8-month-old Clara Nell, who slept through the journey in her basket with the perfect indifference of a baby who had decided the world could come to her. Holt moved his things into the house with the efficiency of a man who had never accumulated much. When he was done, he stood on his front porch and looked at the Ramsey family loaded back into the wagon for the drive home, and he raised one hand, a simple, final gesture, and Calvin raised his hand back. And that was the farewell of 2 men who had been through something real together and did not need more words than that. The new foreman was a man named Gil Torres, Rodrigo Torres' older brother, who had been working the North Side for 3 years and who had the organizational instincts and the steady temperament the job required. He adapted quickly to the dynamic of the Broken Spur's operation, including the understood fact that the South Side had its own authority. He and Ella developed a crisp, functional working relationship from the first month that both of them seemed to find perfectly comfortable, because neither of them had Holt's complicated history with the arrangement. Life at the Broken Spur in 1887 and 1888 settled into a rhythm that had the particular quality of something built and tended with care. The ranch was profitable and well run. The house was full of children, of the smell of Berta's cooking, of books that Ella was always in the middle of, and leaving face down on tables around the house, of the papers and ledgers and correspondence of a working operation, of the occasional visit from Herschel Dane, who was still insufferably pleased with himself regarding the whole situation, and made sure Calvin knew it. In the evenings, when the day's work was done and the children were in bed, Calvin and Ella sat on the porch of the ranch house in the particular quiet of a Texas evening, the sky going from orange to rose to deep purple to star-scattered black above them, and they talked. They talked about everything: the ranch, the children, the books she was reading, the news from San Antonio, the state of the cattle market, the things they remembered about their lives before each other that they had not yet told each other and were still, after years, sharing slowly. They had the conversation of 2 people who had chosen each other with their eyes open and had found in the daily work of being chosen and choosing something that deserved the word love in its fullest sense. Calvin was not a man who said the word easily. He had said it to Clara in the brief year they had had, and then he had not said it to anyone for 15 years. He had said it to Ella for the first time 6 months into their marriage, on a winter evening when they were sitting by the parlor fire, and she had said something that made him laugh, and then something that made him think, and then something that reached straight into the sealed part of him and opened it without effort. And he had said, "I love you, Ella," with the abrupt, slightly rough delivery of a man who meant it completely and was only slightly afraid of what it meant to mean it. She had looked at him with those October sky eyes and said, "I love you too, Calvin. I have for some time." And then she had gone back to what she had been saying, because she was not a woman who needed the moment to be larger than it was, And that was, of course, the exact reason it had been so large. In 1889, James Ramsey turned 4 and was allowed to ride Bramble, the bay mare, in the south pasture with his mother, which he treated as the greatest occasion of his life. Ella put him in front of her on the saddle and let him hold the reins with guidance from her hands around his. And the boy's face was the face of someone who had arrived at exactly the right place. Clara was 2 and watching from the fence with Berta, who held her hand and said things in Spanish about horses and freedom, and the wide land that Clara would remember in a warm, incomprehensible way for the rest of her life. Calvin watched from the fence. He watched his wife and his son moving through the south pasture in the morning light, Bramble's hooves throwing up small puffs of dust, Ella's voice carrying faintly on the breeze as she talked James through the reins, and he thought about the letter he had written in the fall of 1883, the terrible cattle specification letter, and about the courage that had finally made him send it, and about how the most consequential thing he had ever done in his life had also been the most frightening, and how it had brought him to this exact morning, this exact fence, this exact view. He was not a man given to sentiment. He knew that. But standing at the south pasture fence with the sun coming up full and warm over the broken spur, and his daughter saying something to Berta in her small, determined voice, and his wife teaching his son to ride in the pasture she had made her own, he felt something so complete and so good that the only honest response to it was gratitude of the kind that went deeper than words. He thought about Clara, the first Clara, who had died young and whose memory he had carried like a stone for 15 years, and whom he had loved with the whole force of a young man who had not yet learned that love could outlast loss. He let himself think about her fully, the way Ella had made it possible to do, without the weight of guilt, without the fear that loving someone new was a betrayal of someone gone. Clara had been real and good and gone, and James Patrick Ramsey and Clara Nell Ramsey were real and good and here, and Ella Rourke Ramsey was the most real and the most good and the most here of anything he had ever known, and none of it diminished any other part of it. It was all true at once, and the fullness of that truth was not a burden. It was, he realized, the opposite of a burden. It was what holding something up felt like from the inside. Ella turned Bramble in the pasture and saw him at the fence and raised one hand. James raised both hands, letting go of the reins entirely, and Bramble, who was the most patient horse on the Broken Spur, simply stopped and waited for Ella to sort out the reins again. Calvin raised his hand back and watched his wife explain to his 4-year-old son, with the patient clarity of a born teacher, why letting go of the reins was something you did after you stopped and not before. By 1890, the Broken Spur had expanded to 14,000 acres through the purchase of a neighboring parcel that had come available when its owner, an aging bachelor named Fitch, had decided to move back to his family in Georgia. The south side now included the new land, which had a better water source than the original south pasture, and which Ella identified immediately as suitable for a significantly expanded breeding operation. She spent 3 weeks riding the new land before she said anything about it to Calvin, and then she laid out a 5-year development plan at the dining table with the same quiet thoroughness she had brought to everything from the beginning. He read through it and then looked up. "How long have you been working on this?" "Since the day we looked at Fitch's land. I've had the time to think it through." "It's excellent," he said. "I know," she said, without any false modesty, which was something he had always loved about her, the absence of the performance of smallness that many women felt obliged to offer and that wasted everyone's time. "We'll do it," he said. He kissed her. She kissed him back. It was not the first time and it would not be the last time, and it still had the quality of something chosen, which was, both of them had come to understand, the most durable form of anything. The third child came in the summer of 1891. Another boy, born in the heat and noise of July, named William Donald Ramsey William for no particular historical figure, but because both Calvin and Ella agreed it was a solid name that would serve a person well, and Donald from Ella's grandmother's family back in County Clare, a name that connected the child to an island on the far side of the Atlantic, and to a lineage of people who had survived hard things with their dignity intact. 3 children. The house was loud now in the way houses become when they have children in them who are different ages and different temperaments. James at 6, systematic and serious and in love with horses. Clara at 4, loud and quick and with an opinion about everything. William at birth, already clearly someone who intended to make himself heard. Calvin, who had built the Broken Spur in silence and lived in silence for 15 years, had not expected to love the noise. He was consistently surprised to find that he did. Berta Vasquez told Ella in the fall of 1891 that she intended to retire. She was 62, and her daughter in San Antonio had a new baby, and she wanted to be nearby for it. She delivered this news with the dignity of a woman who had served well and knew it, and Ella responded with the respect that was Berta's due, thanking her, meaning it, and making arrangements that included a full year's salary as a parting provision that Calvin authorized without hesitation when Ella proposed it. On Berta's last day, the whole ranch turned out to see her off. Even the South Side hands, even Tors, even the new stable boy who had been hired that spring and had never known the Broken Spur without Berta's cooking and Berta's authority in the kitchen. She shook hands with Calvin, which they both found slightly awkward because they had worked side by side for over 7 years, and a handshake was insufficient, but neither of them was given to demonstrations. She embraced Ella, which was different, a full, genuine embrace that held the weight of 6 years of kitchen mornings and shared confidences, and 2 women who had managed the domestic life of a working ranch together with competence and mutual respect. "You are good for him," Berta said to Ella in the low voice that was meant only for her. "He's good for me," Ella said. "Yes," Berta said, but he needed it more. He had forgotten what good felt like. She pulled back and looked at Ella with the clear, seasoned eyes of a woman who had seen many things. "Don't let him forget again." "I won't," Ella said. She didn't. The years that followed were the years of the Broken Spur's full flower, the period when the accumulated decisions of the previous decade all became results, when the breeding program Ella had built produced a South herd that was consistently the top-performing stock in Bixar County, when the range management practices developed through patient observation and careful record-keeping became so well known that other operations sent their men to the Broken Spur to learn them. Calvin never quite adjusted to the idea that people came to study what his wife had built on the South Side, but he received each visit with gruff courtesy and watched Ella handle the questions with the same patient, direct clarity she brought to everything. James Ramsey, at 8, showed what Calvin had suspected from the first, that he had the instincts of a natural cattleman, that he observed the herd the way Ella observed the breeding records, with a comprehensive attention that built patterns over time. Calvin began taking him along on morning rides by the time the boy was 7, and by 8 James was asking questions about the market and the breeding decisions that made his father answer them seriously rather than with the deflections of adult to child. Clara was louder and faster, and had, by the age of 6, declared that she was going to be a teacher like her mother had been, which prompted a long conversation with Ella that Clara conducted with the intensity of someone settling something important. Ella told her that teaching was one of the finest things a person could do, and that she herself missed it sometimes, the particular work of opening a subject up for someone who had never seen it before. Clara absorbed this with the focused expression that was entirely her father's and then said, "Can you teach me how to teach?" Which was, Ella told Calvin that evening, the most wonderful question she had ever been asked. William, at 2 and 3 and 4, was a person of tremendous physical confidence and very little patience for sitting still, which caused the household no end of gentle chaos, and which both his parents privately found hilarious while maintaining appropriate expressions of parental authority. The Careville Library had, by 1893, grown into its own small building, a wooden structure on the main street, donated by the town council in a vote that Ella had not lobbied for but that had emerged from a community that had discovered it, wanted the thing she had started, and intended to keep it. The building had a sign above the door that said Careville Public Library, and inside it had 412 books and a reading table and 2 chairs and a brass lamp. Ella went every Thursday afternoon, which was when she managed the collections and the lending records. She had trained 2 women from the church, Mrs. Alvarado and Mrs. Payne, to run the day-to-day, and they were very good at it, and the library had its own life now, independent of her daily attention, which was exactly what she had intended. Addie Crane, her first friend in Careville, had married in 1887, a schoolteacher named Henry who had come to Careville from Austin, and who proved to be exactly the right match for Addie in the way that right matches were recognizable. She and Ella maintained their friendship through Thursday afternoons at the library, and through the particular connection of 2 women who had been new in a place at the same time, and had found each other and stayed found. Calvin Ramsey at 43 was not a changed man in the sense that he had replaced himself with someone different. He was still gruff. He still used words sparingly and silence generously. He was still the kind of man who got up before dawn and rode his land in the dark with nothing but the sound of his horse's hooves and the feeling of the ranch beneath him, and who found in that early solitude something that he needed, and that no amount of domestic happiness had replaced. He was still the man who had been forged by loss and had built something enormous from the materials of grief. But he was also the man who came back from that early ride to the kitchen where his wife was making coffee and his children were arguing about something he could hear from the door, and the sound of it was the best sound in the world. Who sat at the table and listened to James explain something he had read in one of Ella's books with the quick, earnest energy of a boy who thought ideas were important. Who reached across the table for Ella's hand because it was there, and because reaching for it was the right thing, as it was every morning. In November of 1893, Calvin took Ella to San Antonio for 3 days, just the 2 of them, the children with Addie Crane in Careville, the ranch in the capable hands of Gil Torres and the Broken Spur's now well-trained staff. He had arranged it without telling her, which was unusual enough that she looked at him suspiciously when he explained it, and then she looked at the arrangements he had made, a good hotel, theater tickets for one evening, no particular agenda, and she said, "You did this yourself." I had help from Addie, but the idea was mine. She looked at him with an expression he had come to recognize as the one that meant she had found him in the exact moment when he was being most clearly himself, and loved what she found. "Thank you," she said. San Antonio in November was cooler than the brutal summer the city shared with the rest of South Texas, and the city had grown significantly since Ella had first come through it in the green wool dress 10 years ago. They walked the streets in the evenings after dinner, not hurrying, looking in the shop windows, watching the city go about its business. One afternoon they went to the river and sat on the bank and talked for 2 hours about nothing in particular and everything that mattered, about the children, about what James might do in 10 years, about whether Clara's declared ambition to teach was the only thing she had in mind or whether there was more, about William's alarming fearlessness, about what the ranch would look like in another decade. "Do you ever miss Ireland?" he asked her, which was a question he had never quite asked directly before. She had been 10 when she left. She barely remembered it consciously, but family history lived in the body, not only in memory. She thought about it seriously, the way she thought about everything. "I miss the idea of it," she said. "I miss my mother's stories about it, but I was American by the time I was old enough to choose, and then I was Texan, and now," she looked at him sidelong, "now I'm a Broken Spur woman, which I think is its own category." "Best category there is," he said. "Extremely partial opinion," she said. "Completely accurate assessment," he said. She laughed and leaned against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat by the river in the November light. This gruff cattleman and this forthright Irishwoman who had found each other through a terrible letter, and a good instinct and the considerable courage of both of them. And the world around them was full of noise and movement and other lives, and there sat quiet and solid inside all of it, held together by the choice they made every day to see each other clearly and to love what they saw. On the last evening in San Antonio at the hotel, Ella asked him a question that she had been turning over in her mind for some time. "Are you happy?" she said, direct as always. Not asking about the ranch or the children or the general state of things, but asking him, the man she had married, the man who had been lonely for 15 years, the man who had held something back from the world for so long that nobody had known for certain it was there. Calvin looked at her across the small table in the hotel room, with the lamp burning between them and the sounds of the city coming through the window. He thought about the morning light on the south pasture, and the sound of his children in the kitchen, and the weight of her hand in his on the river bank that afternoon. He thought about the letter he had nearly burned twice in the platform in San Antonio where she had walked straight toward him and put out her hand. "Yes," he said, simply, completely. "Yes, Ella, I am happy." She looked at him for a long moment, and he saw in her eyes those clear October sky eyes that had seen him from the first day and had never looked away, the same truth reflecting back. "Good," she said. "So am I." They went home to the Broken Spur 2 days later in the early morning, and the ranch was exactly as they had left it, the south pasture running to the horizon in the autumn light, the windmill turning, the horses at the paddock fence, and Ella looked at it as they came over the last ridge in the wagon and said, the way she had said in an entirely different context on their first drive out together 10 years ago, "It's enormous." "The sky," Calvin said. "All of it," she said. "Everything." He looked out at the land that had been built in grief and was now full of something better, and he knew exactly what she meant. James Ramsey came running from the house when he heard the wagon, barefoot despite November, with Clara half a step behind him trying to run faster, and William on the porch with Addie Crane, who was holding him by the back of his shirt to prevent him from trying to catch up. 3 children, each one a separate small astonishment. The house behind them with smoke from the kitchen chimney and the brass lamp in the parlor window already lit in the early morning dark. Calvin helped Ella down from the wagon, and she was immediately at the center of a knot of children, all of them talking at once, each one with something urgent to report about the 3 days they had been away. And Calvin stood at the wagon and watched, and the thing in his chest that had cracked open 6 years ago, standing at a different wagon on a different drive, watching her get off with dust on her green dress, was wide open now and full of this. He unhitched the horse and took him to the stable, and by the time he came back to the house, Ella had sorted the children into their various states and was in the kitchen with Addie making coffee, while the children ran through the rooms in the expansive, slightly chaotic way that children ran through rooms where they were loved and safe. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, and Ella looked up from the coffee pot, and their eyes met, and the look that passed between them was the look of 2 people who had built something real and knew it. The Broken Spur ran for many more years after that. The breeding program Ella had built became one of the most respected in the county, and eventually contributed to a change in standard practices across a significant part of South Texas, which nobody attributed formally to a woman on a ranch in Bixar County, because the world in 1885 or 1895 did not generally work that way, but which was the truth. Documented in Ella's ledgers, which she kept meticulously, and which told the whole story for anyone who could read them and knew what they were looking at. James Ramsey took on more of the ranch management as he grew into his 20s, with the natural ease of someone who had been watching and learning since childhood, and the particular pleasure it gave Calvin to hand his son responsibility was something he had not anticipated, and that turned out to be among the best things he had ever felt. Clara went to the normal school in San Antonio at 17 and came back a certified teacher, which she had promised at 6 and delivered at 23. And she taught at the Careville School for years and was very good at it, which surprised no one. William, the fearless one, became a veterinarian, which surprised everyone but which, in retrospect, made perfect sense. Holt Briggs lived out his retirement in Careville until 1897, when he died peacefully in his house at 63. A man who had ended his years with his garden and his quiet, and a clear conscience about the work he had done. Calvin attended the small funeral and stood at the grave of a man who had been difficult and proud and genuinely good in the way that people sometimes were all three of those things at once, and felt the particular sorrow of outliving someone who had been part of the fabric of what you built. Ella stood beside him at the grave. Holt, in the end, had earned her respect and she had earned his, and she stood with the quiet steadiness she brought to everything. And afterward she took Calvin's hand and held it as they walked back to the wagon, and he squeezed her hand once, which was what they did, which was enough. The Broken Spur in 1900, at the turn of the century, was a different thing than it had been in 1883, not in kind but in fullness, in depth, in the quality of something that had been grown rather than simply built. It had started as a monument to grief and hard will, and somewhere in the last 17 years it had become something else, a testament to the particular courage of a man who had written a terrible letter and a woman who had written back to it, and to what they had made together from the day she stepped off a train with her chin up and her hand out and her eyes clear. Calvin Ramsey at 50 was still gruff, still early to rise, still sparse with words, still the kind of man who did not waste time on things that did not matter. But he was also a man who took his wife's hand at graves and on river banks and at the kitchen table and on the south pasture fence, who sat on the porch in the evenings and watched the stars over the Broken Spur and remembered being asked what they looked like from Texas, and knew now that the answer was that they looked like everything that was possible. On a Tuesday morning in October of 1900, exactly 17 years after Ella had stepped off the train in San Antonio, Calvin Ramsey saddled Copperhead's successor, a big roan named Flint, before dawn, and rode the south pasture as he had done every morning for years. The sun came up red and wide over the Broken Spur, burning off the night mist, turning the grass from silver to gold. He stopped Flint at the top of the ridge that looked out over the whole south side, the repaired fences, the good water troughs, the winter pastures Ella had organized, the breeding corrals she had designed, the whole long, organized living system of it, and he sat there for a long time with the early light all around him. When he rode back to the house, Ella was already at the kitchen table with her coffee and the ledger for the South Side's quarterly accounts, her hair still down from the night, writing in the precise, clear hand that he would have recognized anywhere. James was somewhere in the North Side already early riser, like his father. William was visiting from San Antonio. Clara was at her school. The house was mostly quiet. Calvin poured himself coffee from the pot. He sat across from his wife. She looked up from the ledger and looked at him with those October eyes that had been looking at him for 17 years and still saw him clearly, and which he had been looking back at for 17 years and still found every morning exactly what he needed to find. "Good ride," she said. "Good ride," he said. "South Side looks right." "I know," she said. "I checked it yesterday." "I know you did," he said. She smiled. He reached across the table and turned her ledger toward him without asking, which was something he had started doing 8 years ago when she had finally said, "You don't have to ask permission to look at your own ranch accounts." And he had said, "They're your accounts." And she had said, "They're ours." And that had been that. He looked at the numbers. The South Side was producing at a level that would have been unimaginable to the man who had built the North Side first and treated the South as secondary. "William wants to talk to us about that young woman he's been corresponding with," Ella said, turning a page. "The one in Galveston, the same. Is she a good match?" Ella looked at him over the ledger with a serene expression. "He says she has a forthright and independent temperament." Calvin looked at his wife. His wife looked at him. The particular, private moment of recognition between two people who shared a long private history passed between them with the efficiency of something that had been refined by 17 years of daily use. "Send her a letter," Calvin said. "Tell her to come visit." "I already did," Ella said. He looked at her. "3 days ago," she said without any apology at all. He shook his head. He drank his coffee. Outside the kitchen window, the Broken Spur was wide and golden in the October morning, the south pasture rolling out toward the horizon under a sky that was, as it always had been, enormous, enormous and clear and full of everything that was possible for people who had the sense to reach for it and the courage to hold on. The final word on the south side of the Broken Spur was Ella Rourke Ramsey's, every single day, and it always would be. And it was the best arrangement that had ever been made on that land or perhaps on any land in Bixar County, Texas, in the year of our Lord 1900, and the years before it, and the years to come.